When you think about the physical toll of, drinking alcohol, you probably immediately think of the liver.
Right. Or maybe the brain.
Yeah, exactly, the brain. Especially when you consider the intoxication, the loss of balance, the mood changes.
Mm-hmm.
But what if I told you that your eyes are essentially exposed brain tissue, and that every single drink you take is directly altering their delicate neural wiring?
It really fundamentally reframes how we look at a cocktail, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we tend to view the eye as just this mechanical lens.
Like a camera just bolted to the front of our face.
Right, exactly. But neurologically speaking, the retina and the optic nerve are direct outcroppings of the central nervous system.
Wow.
Yeah, they are literally neural outposts sitting right out there in the open.
Yeah.
And they are intimately bathed in whatever chemical cocktail is currently, circulating through your bloodstream.
Which makes them incredibly vulnerable. And that vulnerability is exactly what we are unpacking today for you, the listener.
It's a fascinating topic.
It really is. We are doing a deep dive into the clinical research of Dr. Fikri El-Saidawad. He's an ophthalmologist who mapped out the profoundly destructive relationship between alcohol and the human eye.
And his work is just a masterclass in connecting physiological disciplines. I mean, he doesn't just look at the eye in total isolation.
Right.
He traces the entire pharmacokinetic journey of the molecule, from the very moment it hits your digestive tract all the way to the moment it degrades your visual cortex.
Yeah, because his research is so incredibly dense and covers just a massive cascade of physiological reactions, we are imposing a strict 50% parameter constraint on ourselves for this deep dive.
Which is definitely necessary.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to rigorously focus on only the first half of this clinical landscape today.
So we're looking at the chemical foundation of alcohol, the metabolic tax it extracts from the liver, and how that specific chemical deficit travels upward to directly attack the optic nerve.
Exactly. The research later delves into the muscular paralysis of the eye, systemic blood vessel impacts, and REM sleep disruption, which is wild stuff. But we are saving all of that structural and muscular fallout for another day.
Yeah, today is entirely about the chemistry and the wiring.
Setting that boundary is vital.
Oh, totally vital.
Yeah.
Because if we don't fully grasp the underlying biochemistry and that metabolic crisis that happens in the abdomen first,
Right.
then the blindness and the visual hallucinations later just seem like, I don't know, random unconnected symptoms.
Like it doesn't make sense.
Exactly. Rather than seeing them as a logical, completely inevitable sequence of cellular starvation.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right at the chemical foundation. We're dealing primarily with ethyl alcohol, or ethanol.
Right.
And biologically speaking, ethanol isn't a nutrient, right? It's a volatile solvent.
Yes. It's fundamentally just a byproduct of yeast metabolizing sugars and starches under very specific thermal conditions.
But beyond just human consumption, the clinical and industrial applications of ethanol really reveal how aggressive this molecule actually is.
You really do. If you look at its properties in a laboratory or, say, a medical setting, ethanol is utilized as a heavy-duty biological solvent.
What does that mean exactly in a clinical setting?
Well, there are highly complex pharmacological compounds, specifically lipid-based, aromatic, or heavy alkaline medications that are completely insoluble in water.
So they just won't dissolve.
Exactly. You could drop them in water, nothing happens. So you have to introduce ethanol to physically break down those molecular bonds so the medication can actually be administered to a patient.
Wow.
And industrially, it's used as an antifreeze because it fundamentally alters the freezing point of liquids. It's also used aggressively as a fat solvent.
Okay, so the exact same chemical mechanism that strips heavy industrial fats and dissolves dense alkaline compounds, that is what you are pouring over ice on a Friday night.
Yes, that is exactly what you're drinking.
And the body has to somehow manage that solvent. So let's trace that journey. You take a drink. How quickly does the solvent actually infiltrate the bloodstream?
Well, the absorption mechanics are almost immediate, but they are highly dependent on your gastric environment.
Okay.
See, ethanol doesn't need to be digested in the traditional sense. It crosses the mucosal barriers directly.
Like straight through the tissue.
Exactly. It begins absorbing through the lining of your mouth the second you take a sip. Then it continues through the stomach wall, and it's rapidly taken up in the duodenum, which is the upper section of the small intestine.
But the concentration gradient and I guess the physical state of the stomach, those dictate the speed, right?
Absolutely.
Because if you throw back a shot of high-proof liquor on a completely empty stomach, there's zero obstruction.
Not at all.
It just flash absorbs across that mucosa lining and spikes your blood alcohol concentration almost instantly.
Exactly. You feel it right away.
Yeah.
Conversely, if you have a heavy meal, especially one rich in fats and proteins, that physically coats the gastric lining.
Oh, so it creates a barrier.
Right, and it delays gastric emptying into the duodenum, so the alcohol gets trapped in the stomach longer, and the absorption curve flattens out.
But regardless of the speed, the destination is always the same, isn't it?
Yes, the portal vein sweeps every single drop of that absorbed ethanol directly into the liver.
And this is where the core metabolic crisis of our entire deep dive begins. The liver is essentially the body's primary chemical refinery.
It's the ultimate filter.
Right. Its job is to detect this toxic solvent and neutralize it before it completely shuts down the central nervous system.
And the liver accomplishes this via a very specific enzymatic pathway. It uses an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase to break the ethanol down into acetaldehyde.
Which is actually highly toxic on its own, right?
Oh, incredibly toxic. So the liver then has to quickly use another enzyme to convert that acetaldehyde into acetic acid.
Because the body can eventually excrete acetic acid.
Right. But this metabolic conversion, this whole process, is not a free biological action. It comes with a staggering physiological cost.
So a metabolic tax.
Yes, the metabolic tax.
This is where the liver basically bankrupts the body's nutritional reserves just to save it from the solvent.
That's a great way to put it. To power those specific enzymatic conversions we just talked about, the liver requires massive amounts of the vitamin B complex.
Particularly thiamine, right? Vitamin B1.
Yes, thiamine is crucial. It is essentially the spark plug for cellular respiration.
The spark plug.
Yeah, without it, your cells simply cannot convert glucose into usable energy.
So when the liver is suddenly flooded with ethanol, it flags it as this acute, life-threatening crisis.
Exactly. And to clear the toxin, the liver pulls all available thiamine from the bloodstream. It just hoards it to fuel the oxidation process.
Okay, let me try an analogy here. I try to picture the liver as this high-intensity global manufacturing factory.
Okay, I like that.
Its daily job is to keep the entire body supplied with energy, right? Carefully distributing resources like thiamine to the brain, the nerves, the heart. But suddenly, a massive shipment of toxic, highly volatile chemicals, the alcohol, is dumped right on the loading dock. It's a red alert emergency.
A total code red.
So to keep the assembly line moving fast enough to clear the poison before it blows up the factory, the manager has to start burning the factory's own structural budget.
Right, they panic.
Yeah, they divert all the power, all the thiamine, just to fuel the incinerators, and they leave the rest of the body starving for that nutrient.
That is exactly what happens. And to take your factory analogy just a step further, the peripheral nervous system, specifically the cranial nerves, are like high-speed fiber optic data cables running out of that factory.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Those cables require constant, massive amounts of power, specifically that thiamine. They need it just to maintain their structural integrity and their protective insulation, which is known as the myelin sheath.
The myelin sheath.
Yeah.
The biological insulation.
Right. So when the factory burns all the B1 to handle the alcohol, those high-speed data cables lose their metabolic power supply. The insulation begins to fray, and the cables literally start to short out.
Wow. And that answers the crucial leap for me. That explains how a localized chemical chaos in the abdomen travels all the way up to the skull.
Exactly.
It's not necessarily that the alcohol itself is floating up and burning the eye, though I know we'll get to direct toxicity in a second. It's that the liver has forced a systemic starvation of the exact nutrient the eye needs to function.
And the optic nerve is perhaps the most demanding, power-hungry data cable in the entire human body.
Let's talk about the specific anatomy of that cable then. If we bypass the spinal nerves and look purely at the peripheral wiring in the skull, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves.
Right, 12 pairs.
And while a few of them handle the mechanical movement of the eye muscles, cranial nerve 2 is really the main event for our deep dive today.
Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. Its sole responsibility is pure visual data transmission.
That's all it does?
That's it. It takes the photic energy captured by the retina and streams it directly into the visual cortex of the brain. It is an incredibly dense, highly specialized bundle of over 1 million nerve fibers.
1 million fibers.
Yeah.
And we know how exquisitely sensitive the eye is to internal body chemistry just by looking at the autonomic nervous system.
Oh, absolutely.
Like when your sympathetic nervous system kicks in during a fight or flight response, adrenaline hits the bloodstream. Instantly, your pupils dilate wide open to maximize light intake.
The eye muscles tense up.
Right, the eyes even bulge slightly. A tiny shift in invisible hormones physically changes the shape and function of the eye in milliseconds.
Which perfectly illustrates the stakes here. What's fascinating here is if the eye reacts that violently to a natural transient hormone like adrenaline,
Right.
imagine the catastrophic structural failure that occurs when you subject that same delicate tissue to a chronic, decade-long starvation of its foundational nutrients,
Yeah.
or, marinated in a volatile solvent.
It's terrifying when you frame it like that. Well, let's look at the two distinct ways that destruction manifests. Because the clinical data categorizes the damage into two distinct vectors, right? A direct attack and an indirect attack.
Yes. Let's start with the direct attack. This is the neurotoxicity of the alcohol molecule itself.
Okay.
When blood alcohol concentrations reach extreme levels, the solvent directly penetrates the central nervous system and induces actual cellular atrophy.
Yeah.
It literally degrades the hardware of the brain itself.
And the clinical presentation of that isn't just, blurred vision. It completely scrambles sensory input.
Completely scrambles it.
A patient experiencing this acute direct neural atrophy begins to suffer from complex hallucinations. They might see literal apparitions or ghosts in the room.
Or they hear phantom voices.
Yeah, or smell specific intense odors like burning rubber or sulfur that simply do not exist.
And the reason that happens is because the visual and auditory cortexes are misfiring. The degraded tissue is sending erratic, chaotic electrical signals.
And the brain is just trying to interpret it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The brain is desperately trying to make sense of the noise, so it renders those misfires as terrifying, fully formed realities.
That is just, wow. But the hallucinations are usually an acute, extreme phase, right?
Right, they happen at extreme peaks of toxicity.
The much more insidious threat, the one that creeps up on a patient over years, is the indirect attack, the systemic starvation we talked about earlier.
Yes.
And when that systemic starvation hyperfocuses on cranial nerve 2, we arrive at a condition known as toxic amblyopia.
Right, so amblyopia refers to a dimming or degradation of vision. And toxic obviously specifies the etiology, in this case, external chemical poisons.
So what is actually happening to the nerve in toxic amblyopia?
It is a chronic, progressive inflammation and demyelination of the optic nerve fibers. Remember that frayed insulation on the data cables we mentioned?
Yes, the myelin sheath shorting out.
Exactly. That is toxic amblyopia.
And alcohol rarely works alone in this scenario, does it? The clinical data highlights a deeply synergistic toxicity here.
It really does. Toxic amblyopia is overwhelmingly prevalent in patients who are heavy, chronic consumers of alcohol and who are also heavy smokers of tobacco.
The deadly duo.
It is a devastating combination because tobacco smoke contains trace amounts of cyanide compounds.
Cyanide, like actual cyanide.
Yes, trace amounts. Now, a healthy liver equipped with proper vitamins can easily detoxify those trace amounts. It's not a problem for a healthy system.
But a liver that is already failing under the burden of chronic alcoholism.
Right. A liver that is completely depleted of vitamin B12, for example, simply cannot neutralize the cyanide.
Oh, wow.
So the cyanide compounds from the tobacco and the ethanol metabolites from the alcohol join forces. They launch a coordinated two-front assault on the optic nerve fibers.
Demographically, this is a slow burn. The data shows this condition typically presents in patients between the ages of 35 and 50.
Yeah, it's a cumulative result of decades of metabolic abuse.
And the onset is terrifyingly subtle. I mean, a patient doesn't just wake up one morning completely blind.
No. They begin to notice a persistent mist or like a foggy veil draped over their visual field.
And that fog is highly dependent on ambient light. Right?
Yes, exactly. Patients often report that the dimness is severely exacerbated in the evening or in low-light environments.
Why is that?
Because the damaged optic nerve fibers are losing their ability to efficiently process low-amplitude visual data. They just don't have the power to pick up weak signals anymore.
But as the disease progresses, toxic amblyopia reveals a very specific, targeted cruelty. It doesn't destroy vision uniformly like a curtain coming down.
No, it doesn't.
It actively seeks out and destroys your central vision.
And this has to do with the metabolic demands of the retina itself.
Yeah.
The very center of your retina is called the macula, and within that is a tiny area called the fovea centralis.
Okay.
This tiny area is packed incredibly densely with cone cells. It is responsible for all of your sharp, high-resolution, detail-oriented vision.
So reading, recognizing faces, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And because it works so incredibly hard, it requires the most metabolic energy, the most thiamine, and the most oxygen.
So when the systemic starvation hits, the hardest working cells die first.
Precisely. The nerve fibers serving the macula undergo necrosis. They just die off. This creates what's known as the central scotoma, which is a literal blind spot dead in the center of the visual field.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. I try to picture it like a reverse camera vignette.
Okay, yeah.
Usually, if you put a heavy filter on a photograph, the outer edges get dark and blurry, but the dead center remains sharply illuminated. Toxic amblyopia is the exact inverse of that.
It is.
The edges of your world remain functional, but the center of your focus is a blacked-out void. Imagine trying to live your daily life where you can walk down the street perfectly fine, but you can never read a book or recognize a face right in front of you again.
It creates a profound clinical paradox. The peripheral vision, which is handled by the less metabolically demanding rod cells on the outer edges of the retina, often remains largely intact.
So the patient can still see movement out of the corner of their eye, they can navigate their living room, walk down a busy street, step around obstacles, all because their spatial awareness survives.
Exactly. But the moment they turn their head to look directly at the friend walking next to them, the face just vanishes into a blur.
That is haunting.
They cannot read a book, they cannot recognize faces, they cannot perform any detail-oriented task. And the sensory degradation extends into color processing too.
Right, because of the cone cells.
Right. The cones in the macula are also responsible for color vision. As they die, the patient develops a specific dyschromatopsia, a form of color blindness.
Specifically regarding the color red, right? They lose the ability to perceive red tones.
Yes.
And that's a classic early-stage hallmark of optic nerve toxicity.
The red-green color axis is highly susceptible to toxic demyelination. So you have a patient navigating a foggy world, unable to recognize faces where all the red hues are just fading to gray.
And this is happening bilaterally, in both eyes.
Yes, both eyes are deteriorating simultaneously, although usually one is marginally worse than the other.
So is there any physiological retreat from this? If a patient is staring into that central void, is the damage permanent, or can the nerve fibers be coaxed back to life?
Well, reversibility is entirely contingent on catching the disease in its early stages. You have to intervene before total axonal death occurs.
Okay, so before the core wire is completely dead.
Right. If the myelin sheath is damaged, but the core of the nerve fiber survives, the clinical intervention is aggressive. First, total and immediate cessation of all alcohol and tobacco.
Cold turkey.
Completely. Moderation is entirely useless here. The toxic cascade must be severed at the root.
Because you can't rebuild the factory while it's still on fire.
Exactly. I love that. Then, the clinician must aggressively counter the metabolic starvation. The patient is flooded with massive clinical intramuscular doses of the vitamin B complex, specifically thiamine and B12.
Why intramuscular? Why not just take a pill?
Because you have to bypass the damaged digestive tract. You force-feed the surviving optic nerves the exact nutrients they've been denied. If you do that, the inflammation can subside, and partial or even full central vision can be restored.
That's incredible. So ethyl alcohol causes this tragedy of slow attrition. It is a decades-long war of nutritional starvation.
Yes, it is.
But the clinical data doesn't let us linger on that slow burn because it sharply pivots to a chemical that bypasses starvation entirely and goes straight for instantaneous destruction.
Right.
And this is where we have to talk about methyl alcohol.
Methanol or wood alcohol.
Yeah.
If ethanol is a slow famine, methanol is an acute chemical fire.
A chemical fire.
From a public health standpoint, methanol poisonings typically occur in localized clusters, and they're usually driven by extreme desperation.
Right.
You see it in geographic regions where regulated ethanol is banned, or within populations struggling with severe addiction who just cannot afford or access safe liquor.
So they turn to industrial spirits, fluids meant for lamps, solvents, antifreeze. And the tragic irony of this is just staggering. Governments and manufacturers deliberately add methanol to these industrial fluids specifically to make them toxic, to deter human consumption.
Yes, the logic is, if we make it poisonous, people won't drink it.
But addiction bypasses logic entirely. People drink it anyway, and the deterrent literally becomes the murder weapon.
It guarantees mass casualty events. And the sheer lethality of methanol isn't just about the molecule itself. It's about what the human liver accidentally turns it into.
Wait, hold on. I need to stop you there and clarify this mechanism because the biochemistry here is horrifying.
It really is.
When the liver encounters ethyl alcohol, it converts it to acetic acid, which depletes your vitamins but is generally survivable, as we discussed.
Right.
What happens when the exact same liver enzymes encounter methyl alcohol?
Okay, so the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase grabs the methanol molecule, just as it would ethanol, but instead of producing acetaldehyde, the enzyme oxidizes the methanol into formaldehyde.
Formaldehyde, as in the literal, highly regulated chemical that morticians use to embalm dead bodies.
Yes.
The chemical that fixes and preserves dead tissue. How does a living liver accidentally synthesize embalming fluid?
It's a tragic lock-and-key mismatch of our evolutionary biology. Our enzymes process the shape of the molecule, completely blind to the lethal byproduct they are creating.
Oh, man.
The liver churns out formaldehyde, which is violently toxic to living cellular tissue, but it doesn't even stop there. Another enzyme quickly oxidizes the formaldehyde into formic acid.
And what does formic acid do to the body?
Formic acid is a mitochondrial poison. Inside every single cell in your body, you have mitochondria generating the energy required for life.
The powerhouse of the cell.
Exactly. Formic acid directly binds to and inhibits an enzyme inside the mitochondria called cytochrome SCAC oxidase.
So it breaks the powerhouse.
It essentially stops cellular respiration at a microscopic level. The cells cannot utilize oxygen at all. They literally suffocate and die.
And the optic nerve, being the most metabolically demanding, oxygen-hungry data cable in the body, is the first to suffocate.
It is instantaneous, targeted cellular asphyxiation. The clinical presentation of methanol poisoning is violently acute.
So there is no slow, misty fog over 20 years like with ethyl alcohol.
No. Within hours of ingestion, the patient suffers blinding headaches, severe nausea, profound vertigo, and a rapid, terrifying blurring of vision as the optic nerve cells just suffocate.
And if the patient somehow survives the systemic shock, if their central nervous system doesn't shut down entirely and they wake up from the coma, what happens to their vision?
They awake to primary optic atrophy. Unlike toxic amblyopia, which is a slow demyelation and inflammation that can potentially be reversed with vitamins.
Right, look what we talked about earlier.
Primary optic atrophy means the main axis of the nerve itself, the core structural wire, has been completely obliterated by the formic acid.
So the visual field doesn't just lose its center. The peripheral vision aggressively collapses inward, the darkness spreads rapidly, and the remaining vision shrinks into absolutely nothing.
It is total, permanent, irreversible blindness.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot use vitamin B to resurrect an optic nerve that has been chemically embalmed and suffocated. The pathway between the retina and the visual cortex is just permanently severed.
It's a staggering contrast that perfectly illustrates the value of Dr. Awad's approach to this. Both chemicals are classified casually as alcohol. They're both simple molecules of carbon, hydrogen, and a hydroxyl group. But because of one tiny structural difference, the liver processes one by slowly dimming the lights over 30 years via nutritional theft.
Right.
And it processes the other by dropping a biological bomb on the power grid.
The underlying chemistry absolutely dictates the ultimate pathology. You simply cannot understand the blindness without understanding the enzymes first.
Which brings us to the core takeaway of this deep dive. Why does this incredibly dense biochemical exploration of the optic nerve matter to you, the listener, especially if you aren't an ophthalmologist?
It's a great question.
It matters because it shatters the illusion of biological compartmentalization. We like to think of our bodies as machines with perfectly sealed, separate compartments. Like, a liver problem stays in the liver. An eye problem stays in the eye.
But the body operates as a fiercely interconnected, deeply reactive ecosystem. Every organ is in constant critical conversation with every other organ via the bloodstream and the peripheral nervous system.
Exactly. The idea that what you pour into your stomach just stays in your stomach is a comforting myth.
Nodal myth.
What you ingest, the volatile solvents you expose your liver to, dictates the literal physical wiring of how your brain perceives the universe.
Yeah.
A chemical fire in the abdomen inevitably burns down the optical cables in the skull.
You simply cannot force a massive metabolic tax onto one system without sending devastating ripples through the entire biological network. It just doesn't work that way.
We've covered a tremendous amount of physiological ground today, just by looking at the first half of Dr. Awad's work. But as we wrap up this exploration, we always want to leave you with a larger question to carry forward.
And I think if we pull back from the extreme pathology of alcohol toxicity and look at the broader implications for our daily health, This physiological mechanism forces a profound realization.
Which is?
Well, our eyes are literally the window to the outside world, right? But neurologically, they are functioning as an internal biological dashboard. They are acutely sensitive warning lights for deep metabolic crises.
Like a canary in a coal mine.
Precisely. If a lack of a single nutrient thiamine can physically black out the center of your vision and erase the color red from your world, what other subtle, easily ignored sensory changes is your body using right now to signal an invisible internal deficit?
Oh.
Think about it. Is sudden shift in your sense of taste a phantom scent, or a slight persistent ringing in your ears just a random annoyance of getting older? Or is it your central nervous system's early warning system, desperately trying to signal that somewhere deep inside the factory, a critical metabolic tax is going completely unpaid?
So what if the everyday chemical in your Friday night cocktail actually had the raw physiological power to physically erase the color red from your vision?
I mean, it sounds like science fiction, right? Or maybe a side effect of some rare exotic venom. But it is actually a very real, heavily documented medical mechanism.
Yeah, and welcome to today's deep dive. We are so thrilled you're here with us. If you are someone who is, intensely curious about the intricate, often invisible connections between the substances we interact with every single day and the delicate machinery of human biology, well, you are in the right place.
Exactly. Because today, we're going completely microscopic.
Yeah, we're going to look at something so ubiquitous in society that we almost never think of it as a chemical compound. We are talking about alcohol.
Right, but we're stripping away the cultural baggage here. We aren't looking at a nice glass of wine or a beautifully garnished cocktail. We are looking at a solvent. We are looking at sheer biology.
Totally. So today's mission is a deep exploration of the first half of a truly fascinating medical analysis by Dr. Fikri El Said Awad. He's an ophthalmologist who literally mapped out the catastrophic effects of this specific chemical on the human eye.
It's a brilliant text.
It really is. We're going to trace the physiological journey of alcohol starting from the exact moment it hits your tongue. We'll track its path through the digestive system, investigate the massive metabolic toll it takes on the liver, and then...
This is the crazy part.
Yeah, then we follow its destructive path straight up into the nervous system and directly into your optic nerve.
Right. The goal here is to connect these biological dots for you. We need to look at cause and effect at a cellular level.
Right, understanding not just what happens to the body, but the underlying mechanical logic of why it actually happened.
Exactly. But before we can even begin to understand how this substance affects the eyes or the liver, I feel like we need to define what it actually is on a fundamental level.
Yes, exactly. If we strip away the marketing and the social rituals, what is actually sitting in the glass?
Well, from a purely chemical standpoint, we are dealing with a relatively simple molecular structure. It is a compound made of carbon and hydrogen atoms, terminating in a hydroxyl group.
Okay, hydroxyl group.
Right, which is really just an oxygen and a hydrogen atom bonded together. So the chemical formula is CHOH. Specifically, we were talking about ethyl alcohol or ethanol, which is the variant manufactured for human consumption.
And how does that specific, that CHOH molecule actually come into existence? Because it doesn't just magically appear in nature ready to drink, does it?
No, not at all. It is entirely a biological byproduct. It is created through fermentation.
Right.
You introduce yeast, which is a single-celled fungus, to a food source. And that food source is usually sugars found naturally in fruit, like grapes, or starches found in grains, like barley.
And the yeast just eats it?
Exactly. The yeast consumes those sugars for energy. But for this specific chemical to be produced, the environment has to be, well, tightly controlled.
Meaning like temperature and oxygen levels?
Precisely. The yeast requires a very specific regulated temperature to undergo anaerobic respiration.
Which means without oxygen, right?
Yes, processing the sugars without oxygen. As the yeast digests the sugar under those conditions, it excretes ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide as waste products.
Wow.
Yeah, that controlled chemical reaction is what actually yields the ethanol.
See, here is the part of the analysis that completely reframed my understanding. Because of that specific molecular structure, that CHOH ethyl alcohol is incredibly useful outside of a beverage context.
Oh, absolutely. It is an industrial powerhouse.
It really is. It's fundamentally a solvent.
Right. And a solvent is simply a substance capable of dissolving other substances. It actively breaks down molecular bonds.
Right. So when I think of a solvent, I think of like paint thinner or industrial grease remover.
And you wouldn't be wrong at all. I mean, ethyl alcohol is heavily utilized in medicine and industry for exactly that property.
Wow.
In a medical setting, it is a potent antiseptic because it actively dissolves the protective lipid layers, the fat membranes of bacteria and microorganisms.
It literally tears them apart.
Exactly, effectively tearing them apart. It is also used to dissolve fat-based or alkaline drugs that refuse to dissolve in plain water.
So it's basically a chemical master key.
That's a great way to put it.
It unlocks and breaks down materials that water just can't touch. I was actually reading that in the manufacturing of perfumes, they rely heavily on alcohol to dissolve these thick aromatic oils and fats so they can be, sprayed as a liquid mist.
Right, that lipid dissolving property is the key takeaway here. And in heavy industry, ethyl alcohol is used to dissolve incredibly tough industrial fats.
I mean, that makes sense.
It is used in heavy compression processes. Its freezing point is so incredibly low that it resists crystallization, which makes it highly effective as a commercial antifreeze.
Okay, so that presents such a jarring biological paradox for you, the listener, to consider.
It really does.
Right. On one hand, you have a substance robust enough to dissolve industrial fats, act as a chemical antifreeze, and tear apart bacterial cell walls. On the other hand, it's poured over ice with a twist of lime. What actually happens when a universal solvent, a fat-dissolving chemical, is introduced into the incredibly delicate water and fat-based machinery of the human body?
Well, the biological reality is that it doesn't lose its chemical identity just because it was poured from a nice bottle.
Exactly.
It enters the body and it continues to act as a solvent. I mean, the human body is a landscape of soft tissues, delicate mucosal membranes, and highly sensitive nerve fibers insulated by fat.
Right, all fat.
So when you introduce a powerful solvent into that environment, the physiological drama begins immediately.
So let's follow that solvent. Let's look at the actual mechanics of absorption. Once I take a sip, what is the sequence of events? How does the body actually process this chemical?
The first thing to understand is that alcohol is a biological rule breaker. Most of what you consume, proteins, complex carbohydrates, fats, it all has to be broken down by stomach acids and intestinal enzymes before your body can absorb it.
Like standard digestion.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But alcohol does not need to be digested. Its molecular structure allows it to simply slip through the cellular barriers.
Wait, it just bypasses the entire digestive breakdown process?
Yes, completely. It passes directly through the mucosal linings. A small amount is absorbed instantly through the tissues in the mouth.
Just right away.
Yeah. And then the vast majority is absorbed rapidly through the stomach lining, or it passes into the duodenum, which is the very first section of the small intestine, and is absorbed there.
Okay, now I really want to ask about a massive cultural myth regarding this absorption process, because everyone has heard the advice, make sure you eat a huge, heavy meal before you drink.
Oh, yes. The burger myth.
Right. If I eat a massive burger, does that food actually protect my body? Like, does a full stomach stop the solvent from doing cellular damage?
It is such a vital distinction to make. Eating food does absolutely nothing to neutralize the chemical formula of ethyl alcohol.
Nothing at all.
Nothing. The solvent remains a solvent. What the food does is act as a physical buffer. It changes the physical dynamics of the stomach.
So like putting a sponge in a bucket of water.
Somewhat, yeah. If you have an empty stomach and consume alcohol, particularly at a low concentration, there is nothing impeding it. The solvent hits the stomach lining and diffuses across the cellular gradient into the bloodstream almost immediately.
It's just a free-for-all.
It is a rapid, unimpeded infiltration. But if the stomach is full of heavy food, the alcohol mixes with that physical mass.
Mm-hmm.
The food prevents the alcohol from making direct, immediate contact with the absorptive membranes.
Ah, I see. So it's purely a matter of traffic control.
Exactly. It slows down the rate of absorption drastically. You prevent an immediate, overwhelming spike in your blood alcohol concentration.
But the damage is still happening.
Yes. And this is the crucial physiological reality. Every single molecule of that alcohol must still be absorbed and processed.
Right.
The total workload and the total chemical exposure to your internal organs remains exactly the same. You have merely altered the schedule of delivery.
Wow. And the primary organ tasked with handling that delivery is the liver. Once the alcohol crosses the stomach lining or the duodenum, it enters the bloodstream. And those blood vessels act like a direct, high-speed transit line, carrying the solvent straight to the liver.
Yeah, the liver is essentially the body's primary chemical filtration plant. Its job is to identify foreign toxins and metabolically disarm them before they can circulate too heavily to the brain and the heart.
Okay.
So when the ethyl alcohol arrives, the liver is forced to initiate a very specific, intensive metabolic process.
And this metabolic process is where the unseen damage really begins, right? Because the liver's job is to convert the alcohol into acetic acid. And then that acetic acid has to undergo oxidation to eventually be broken down into water and carbon dioxide.
Yes,
But this chemical reaction has a massive hidden cost.
it does. The liver cannot perform this oxidation on its own. Chemical reactions in the body require catalysts and coenzymes.
Right.
To break down this specific solvent, the liver demands a massive influx of the vitamin B complex, particularly vitamin B1, which is known as thiamine.
Wait, why vitamin B1? Like, what is so special about that specific nutrient that the liver suddenly needs a massive supply of it?
Well, thiamine is essentially a metabolic spark plug. It is a critical coenzyme required for the oxidation of carbohydrates and acids.
Okay.
Without thiamine, the enzymatic machinery that breaks down the acetic acid simply stalls. It won't work.
Wow.
So the liver, facing an influx of this toxic solvent, sends out an emergency signal and begins pulling all available thiamine and lipid proteins from the body's reserves to fuel this breakdown process.
I want to make sure I'm fully grasping the severity of this. The liver is basically levying a massive, non-negotiable vitamin tax on the rest of the human body just to deal with the alcohol.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. And the biological trade-off is just staggering. The body is forced to cannibalize its own internal supply of the vitamin B complex.
Oh, man.
Now, we have to ask why this matters so deeply. Vitamin B is not just a generic supplement for, like, extra energy.
Right.
It is the fundamental, non-negotiable nutrient required for the health, structural maintenance, and protective insulation of the entire human nervous system.
So by forcing the liver to process this solvent, the body is actively starving its own nerves.
Exactly. The liver is forced into triage. It prioritizes disarming the immediate toxin over the long-term structural health of the nervous system.
It has to make a choice.
Right. It creates a cascading systemic deficit. And it's important to note that while the liver is frantically draining the body of vitamins to perform this chemistry, the liver cells themselves are suffering direct toxic damage from physical contact with the solvent.
It's a catastrophic double down. The liver takes direct structural damage and simultaneously strips the nervous system of the exact nutrients it needs to survive.
Precisely.
And all of this microscopic chaos is happening before the major effects of the alcohol have even fully distributed to the brain.
Which brings us to the destination. We know the solvent is in the blood, and we know the body has just been severely depleted of vitamin B.
Right.
To understand how this ultimately leads to a person losing their sight, we really have to map out the wiring.
Yes. Let's visualize the anatomy of the human nervous system. For you listening, let's imagine an incredibly complex, high-tech fiber optic network. The central processing unit, the main server room, is the central nervous system, or the CNS.
Right, the CNS consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Within the brain, you have highly specialized, localized processing centers.
Like individual servers.
Exactly. There's a dedicated biological server for processing visual data, another for auditory data, another for speech. These are the interpretation hubs.
Okay, then you have the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. If the brain is the server room, the PNS is the vast, intricate network of physical fiber optic cables running out of the walls, right? Connecting the servers to every single camera, microphone, and motor in the building.
That's a perfect analogy. And the anatomy divides this peripheral network into 3 distinct categories.
Okay.
The first is the cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of these specific nerves.
And these are unique, right? They don't travel down the spinal cord like the rest of the nerves.
No, they do not. The cranial nerves emerge directly from the underside of the brain itself. They bypass the spinal highway entirely to directly, rapidly interface with the critical structures of the head and face.
Which makes sense for the eyes.
Exactly. When we look at the physiological impact of alcohol on vision, 4 of these 12 cranial nerves are absolutely vital to understand.
And the heavyweight among them is the second cranial nerve. This is the optic nerve. This isn't just a minor wire. This is the primary high-voltage fiber optic cable dedicated entirely to the sense of sight. It carries the massive stream of visual data directly from the retina in the back of your eye straight into the visual processing centers of the brain.
And while the second cranial nerve carries the sensory input, the third, fourth, and sixth cranial nerves handle the mechanical output. They are motor nerves.
Okay, so they move things.
Right. They control the complex, hyper-coordinated physical movements of the eyeballs themselves.
The structural precision here is just amazing. I mean, the fourth cranial nerve, for example, exists to control just one single muscle, the superior oblique muscle.
Right.
And the sixth cranial nerve controls the lateral rectus muscle. These are the tiny microscopic biological pulleys that allow you to, track a moving object or read a line of text left to right without turning your head.
So that is the direct wiring to the eyes. The second division of the peripheral nervous system consists of the spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of these emerging from the spinal column, serving as the standard cables running out to control your arms, your legs, your torso.
Got it. And the third division is where the background processing happens, the autonomic nervous system.
Yes, the autonomic system is the biological smart grid. It is entirely involuntary. It manages all the physiological processes that you do not consciously control: digestion, respiratory rate, and, critical for our discussion, pupillary response.
Right, so it's the system that dilates your pupils when you walk into a dark room without you having to think about it.
Precisely. And this autonomic system is a delicate balancing act between two opposing forces.
Okay, what are they?
You have the sympathetic nervous system, which is the famous fight or flight response.
Ah, right.
When the brain perceives a threat, the sympathetic system floods the body with signals. It commands the pupils of the eyes to dilate massively, to let in as much light and visual information as possible.
To see the threat.
Exactly. It also causes the heart rate to accelerate, blood pressure to spike, and muscles to engorge with blood. It is a biological alarm state.
But you can't live in a permanent state of biological alarm. I mean, the engine would literally burn out.
Which is exactly why the counterpart exists.
Yeah.
The parasympathetic nervous system.
Right.
This is the rest and digest mechanism. Once a threat has passed, the parasympathetic system activates, returning the body to a baseline state of calm. It constricts the pupils back to a normal size, slows the heartbeat, and lowers the blood pressure.
Okay, so we have this beautifully balanced, intricate network, the central processing servers in the brain, the high-speed fiber optic cables, the precise motor wires controlling the muscles, and the autonomous smart grid managing the tension in the background.
Yes, and this is where the underlying tragedy of alcohol consumption becomes so apparent.
Yeah.
Because when this potent fat-dissolving solvent enters the bloodstream, it doesn't isolate its damage to just one localized area.
It hits everything.
It permeates the entire grid simultaneously. It infiltrates the visual servers in the CNS, it disrupts the involuntary autonomic pupil controls, and it directly assaults the cranial fiber optic cables.
So how does that destruction actually happen on a microscopic level? I mean, we know the solvent hits the nerves, but what is the physical mechanism of the breakdown? Because the medical consensus identifies a very specific two-pronged attack on human perception.
Right. The damage pathways are categorized into direct impact and indirect impact. And unfortunately, both biological assaults are happening concurrently.
Okay, let's start with the direct impact, because exploring the actual physical degradation of a nerve is just chilling. When ethyl alcohol comes into physical contact with nerve cells, it causes them to atrophy.
Yes, and to understand atrophy, we have to look at the anatomy of the nerve itself. The optic nerve, like most high-speed nerves, is wrapped in a protective coating called the myelin sheath.
Okay.
Think of it as the thick rubber insulation around a copper electrical wire. This myelin sheath is primarily composed of lipids. It is a fat-based protective layer.
Wait. And we established in the very beginning that ethyl alcohol is, fundamentally, an industrial-grade solvent highly effective at dissolving fats.
Yes. The collision of those two biological realities is devastating. The alcohol actively begins to dissolve and degrade the lipid-rich myelin sheath.
Oh, wow.
As the insulation breaks down, the core nerve cylinder is exposed and damaged. The physical structure of the cell begins to literally waste away. It shrinks.
So what happens to the sensory signals when the insulation on the fiber optic cable is melted away, like the data?
The signals misfire. They cross-contaminate. The data stream becomes corrupted.
And the physiological symptom of that corrupted data is something we usually associate with, like psychiatric events, hallucinations.
Exactly.
The physical deterioration of these specific nerve cells is exactly what causes a person to see ghosts or shadows in the corner of their eye, to hear phantom voices, or to smell odors that simply aren't in the room.
That is a critical realization. When a person under severe alcohol intoxication begins seeing shadows or hearing voices, it is not a harmless chemical glitch. It is not an abstract psychological event. It is the real-time subjective experience of physical nerve cells actively dying and short-circuiting in their brain.
That is terrifying.
It is. The visual cortex is receiving corrupted data because the optic pathways are physically fraying. The hardware itself is structurally failing.
That is the raw physical violence of the direct attack. But while the solvent is actively melting the insulation off the cables, the body is simultaneously suffering the indirect attack.
Right, which circles back to the liver's metabolic tax we explored earlier.
The vitamin attack?
Exactly. The severe systemic depletion of the vitamin B complex.
Why is that specifically so devastating to the nerve while it's under attack? Like, why does it matter right then?
Because vitamin B, specifically thiamine and B12, are the exact foundational building blocks the body uses to maintain and repair the myelin sheath.
Oh my God. The cruelty of this biological mechanism is almost hard to overstate. The alcohol is acting as a toxic solvent, actively dissolving the fat-based insulation around the nerves.
Right.
And simultaneously, because the liver is desperately trying to metabolize that exact same chemical, the body's completely starved of the very vitamins the nerves desperately need to defend themselves or rebuild the melted insulation.
It's biological sabotage. The solvent is burning the cellular walls down, while the liver has requisitioned all the bricks and mortar the body could use to rebuild them.
Wow.
And the optic nerve, because of its massive size, high fiber density, and immense metabolic demand, is exceptionally vulnerable to this very specific combination of direct chemical toxicity and deep nutritional starvation.
Which naturally leads us to the ultimate consequence of this two-pronged attack.
Yes.
When the optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, is subjected to this chronic dual assault of ethyl alcohol and vitamin starvation, it results in a condition medically known as toxic amblyopia.
Right. Amblyopia refers to the dimming or dullness of vision. Toxic amblyopia is a slow, chronic theft of sight directly induced by a poisonous substance.
So who is actually experiencing this? Is this something that happens after, one heavy weekend?
No. This is the result of a sustained, prolonged siege on the nervous system. The demographic primarily affected are chronic drinkers, typically presenting symptoms between the ages of 35 and 50.
Okay, so it takes a while.
It takes years, often decades, of the solvent slowly degrading the optic pathways and the chronic vitamin B starvation preventing adequate repair.
But the timeline can be radically accelerated. And this is where we encounter what can only be described as a deadly biological synergy.
It is.
Because the development and severity of toxic amblyopia is exponentially worse if the chronic drinker happens to be a smoker.
Yes, the interplay between different compound toxins is a major focus in neuro-ophthalmology.
We really have to stop and consider how culturally paired these two habits are. Having a drink and smoking a cigarette are incredibly common, intertwined social rituals.
Very common.
But on a microscopic level inside the eye, they are actively collaborating to destroy the optic nerve fibers. The alcohol's melting the myelin and draining the vitamins, but what exactly is the tobacco doing to accelerate this?
Well, tobacco smoke introduces a massive load of highly reactive oxidative toxins and heavy metals directly into the bloodstream.
Okay.
These compounds cause severe oxidative stress to cellular tissues. Now remember, the optic nerve is already in a state of metabolic emergency from the alcohol and the thiamine deficiency.
Right, it's already dying.
Exactly. So when you introduce the vascular constriction and the direct neurotoxins of tobacco into that fragile environment, it completely overwhelms the nerve's depleted defenses. The tobacco basically acts as a chemical accelerant to the cellular destruction.
So how does this destruction actually manifest for the person experiencing it? How does the brain perceive this slow death of the optic nerve? Because it doesn't happen all at once, right?
No, it's gradual.
The first symptom is incredibly subtle. A patient will start to notice what is described as a fog or a physical mist settling over their vision.
Yeah, it is an insidious, creeping degradation of visual clarity.
And what's fascinating neurologically is that this fog is incredibly specific to the environment. Patients almost always notice it first in the evening or in dim light.
And that is entirely consistent with the mechanics of cellular failure.
Really? How so?
Well, in bright sunlight, the eye has an abundance of photons to stimulate the retinal receptors. It's easy. But in dim light, the eye requires maximum efficiency from every single cellular receptor and maximum bandwidth from the optic nerve to gather and transmit those low-level light signals to the brain.
Oh, wow.
So if the optic nerve fibers are slowly atrophying, those faint, low-level signals are the very first data points to be lost in the noise of a failing cable.
So the fog is basically just the brain struggling to process an incomplete data stream.
Exactly.
But once that evening fog sets in and becomes permanent, the degradation moves to the next stage, a steady, terrifying drop in central vision.
Right. Central vision is the sharp, detailed focal point of your sight. It is entirely dependent on a tiny, incredibly dense area in the center of the retina called the macula and the massive bundle of optic nerve fibers connected directly to it.
And because that area is so dense with data, I imagine it requires a massive amount of energy to function.
It does. The macular fibers are highly demanding of energy and nutrients. And because their metabolic demand is so high, they are the very first fibers to structurally fail under the systemic thiamine starvation.
Wow. So as those central fibers die, the patient loses the ability to perform close-up work. Reading becomes difficult, then impossible. Faces looking directly at them become blurred.
Yeah.
And this is a bilateral condition, right? It affects both eyes, though the atrophy usually progresses slightly faster in one eye than the other. Your entire visual interface with the world is systematically shutting down.
And when an ophthalmologist examines the eye of a patient at this stage, the subjective symptoms are matched by stark, visible physical damage.
They can literally look into the eye and see opacities in the visual field. They map out literal dark spots or cloudy voids where the optic nerve has completely ceased transmitting data.
Exactly.
But perhaps the most jarring specific symptom of this failing hardware is the onset of colorblindness.
Right, because the perception of color is not a baseline function. It is a highly complex, metabolically expensive neurological process.
In the early stages of toxic amblyopia, patients lose the ability to see a very specific wavelength. They lose the color red.
Yes.
It isn't a situation where the entire world suddenly goes to grayscale. It's a targeted surgical deletion of the color red from their visual reality.
Yeah.
Why red?
Well, the retina relies on photoreceptor cells called cones to process color. The specific cones that translate the longer wavelengths of red light and the highly specialized nerve fibers that carry those dense, high-bandwidth color signals to the brain are excludedly sensitive to toxic damage and nutritional deprivation.
Okay, so they're fragile.
Very fragile. When the optic nerve begins to atrophy, the ability to transmit the complex data for the color red fails first. Losing the perception of red is a glaring biological alarm bell that the optic nerve is entering a state of critical structural failure.
And if the environmental toxins, the drinking and the smoking are not stopped, the biological endgame is grim.
Very grim.
The retinal cells degenerate completely. The central vision is entirely wiped out. The patient can no longer read, they cannot drive, they cannot recognize a loved one standing right in front of them.
Yeah.
Their reality is reduced to relying entirely on their peripheral vision, looking out of the extreme corners of their eyes, just to detect enough movement to navigate walking around a room.
It is a profound loss of human autonomy, driven entirely by the chronic ingestion of a common solvent.
It really is.
And the ultimate tragedy of toxic amblyopia is its initial subtlety. Because it starts as nothing more than a mild evening fog or a slight difficulty reading a menu in a dim restaurant, the vast majority of patients likely dismiss the symptoms.
They assume it's just normal aging. They think they are just tired, or that they need to update the prescription on their reading glasses.
Right, they rationalize the sensory loss, completely unaware that their optic nerve is actively dissolving and starving. By the time the central vision drops significantly and they seek serious medical intervention, they have allowed the chronic degeneration of the nerve cells to advance dangerously far.
So is there a point of no return? Is there a treatment?
There is a treatment, provided it is initiated in the early stages before the nerve fibers undergo complete irreversible death.
Okay.
Once a neuron is fully dead, the central nervous system cannot regenerate it. But if caught early, the protocol is aggressive.
Yeah, it is not a gentle, gradual approach. The medical mandate requires total, absolute cessation of both alcohol and smoking. There's no moderation, no cutting back to 1 glass a week. The introduction of any solvent or oxidative toxin must be immediately halted.
Exactly. The biological scaffolding cannot be repaired while the demolition crew is still actively working inside the cells.
I love that analogy. Once the toxins are removed, the second phase of treatment directly addresses the liver's metabolic tax. The patient must undergo massive medical-grade administration of the vitamin B complex,
Yes.
specifically flooding the system with thiamine and B12.
It is a desperate race to restore the body's nutritional baseline. The goal is to provide the surviving, damaged nerve cells with an overwhelming supply of the raw materials they need to stabilize the myelin sheath and halt the progress of the primary atrophy.
Okay, so we have spent a long time exploring the slow, chronic, decades-long burn of ethyl alcohol, the slow theft of the color red, the creeping evening fog, but the biological reality of alcohol doesn't end there.
No, it does not.
There is another variant of this chemical structure, one that does not take decades to destroy the optic nerve. It takes hours.
This is a critical distinction in the chemistry of solvents. While ethyl alcohol induces chronic, slow-moving damage, this specific variant acts as an acute, immediate chemical weapon targeted directly at the optic nerve.
We are looking at methyl alcohol, commonly referred to as wood alcohol. From a purely toxicological standpoint, this is the most lethal, toxic variant of alcohol in existence.
Yes. And while the molecular structure is only slightly different from ethyl alcohol, it has one less carbon atom and two fewer hydrogen atoms. The human body's metabolic reaction to methyl alcohol is violently, fundamentally different.
Now, a listener might wonder why anyone would ever ingest something so lethal. The historical and chemical context here is deeply sobering. Methyl alcohol is heavily utilized as an industrial solvent and fuel, but it is also intentionally added to bulk industrial ethyl alcohol, the kind used for manufacturing or fuel purposes.
Right, the process is known chemically as denaturing.
And the purpose of denaturing is to intentionally poison a cheap industrial alcohol to prevent human consumption. This is usually enforced by regulations in areas where standard drinking liquor is restricted, heavily taxed, or outright banned. The goal is deterrence.
However, when individuals driven by severe addiction, poverty, or lack of access to safe alternatives consume this denatured spirit anyway, the biochemical consequences are catastrophic.
Right.
It transforms a slow, chronic vice into a rapid, mass casualty medical event.
The outcome is brutal. Unlike standard liquor, which degrades the body over decades, ingesting methyl alcohol is an immediate, critical threat to life. And the reason it is so deadly comes down to the precise mechanics of how the liver attempts to process it.
The metabolic pathway for methyl alcohol is a physiological nightmare.
We established earlier that the liver converts standard ethyl alcohol into acetic acid. But when the liver encounters methyl alcohol, the enzymatic breakdown produces two horrifying chemical byproducts, formaldehyde and formic acid.
Formaldehyde.
Yeah. When I read that, it literally stopped me in my tracks. Formaldehyde is the exact chemical used in mortuaries to embalm corpses.
Yes, it is.
It is used to preserve dead tissue in biology labs. The sheer, terrifying biological reality of your own liver internally manufacturing formaldehyde, pumping it into your bloodstream, and allowing it to pool directly behind your eyes. I mean, what does that actually do to living tissue?
Well, formaldehyde is a highly reactive fixative. It rapidly causes cross-linking in proteins.
Meaning what exactly?
Imagine the flexible, dynamic, moving proteins that make up the cellular machinery of your eye suddenly being chemically welded together, frozen in place.
Oh my God.
It is profoundly toxic to living nerve tissue, and its partner, formic acid, is equally devastating. Formic acid drastically lowers the pH level of the blood.
It turns the bloodstream acidic.
It induces severe metabolic acidosis.
Mm-hmm.
An acidic environment destroys the ability of cells to utilize oxygen, essentially suffocating the body at a microscopic level. The combination of tissue welding formaldehyde and oxygen-starving formic acid is fatal.
The physiological symptoms of this poisoning reflect a body in total systemic collapse. Following ingestion, the patient is hit with severe, crippling nausea, an agonizing splitting headache, and rapid blurring of vision.
And this aggressively progresses into a deep coma.
Wow.
The basic life support systems of the central nervous system simply shut down under the sudden spike in overwhelming toxicity.
And if a patient is brought into an emergency room, and the medical team manages to miraculously stabilize their organs, balance their blood pH, and pull them out of the coma, saving their life, the specific damage to the eyes is usually irreversible.
Yeah, the life of the patient may be saved, but the optic nerve is almost always beyond rescue. The highly concentrated localization of formaldehyde and formic acid specifically targets the delicate, high-energy structures of the retina and the optic nerve.
The timeline of destruction is staggering compared to the decades-long process of toxic amblyopia. With methyl alcohol, the patient's visual field rapidly, aggressively narrows. The darkness closes in from the edges within days, sometimes hours, ending in total, permanent blindness.
And the medical diagnosis for this rapid destruction is primary optic atrophy.
Right.
Primary optic atrophy signifies that the nerve fibers are dying directly from a massive toxic insult. They are not slowly degrading from secondary swelling or a lack of vitamins. The chemical itself is acting as an acute cellular poison.
The biological mechanism here is that the cellular degeneration starts right at the retina, the front line of visual processing, and rapidly burns its way backward along the optic nerve toward the brain. The high-voltage fiber optic cable connecting the eye to the visual cortex is literally chemically severed.
It is a profound, rapid destruction of the sensory hardware, caused entirely by the body's fatal inability to safely metabolize one specific variant of a simple chemical structure.
It is an incredible, almost overwhelming amount of physiological information to process. When
Yeah.
you truly look at the microscopic mechanics, it completely changes how you view a substance that is entirely normalized in our daily lives.
The contrast between the cultural perception of alcohol and its harsh biochemical reality is vast.
It really is. Let's briefly retrace the incredible biological journey we've mapped out today. We started by looking at the pure chemistry, identifying ethyl alcohol as a CHOH compound, a potent, fat-dissolving industrial-grade solvent.
We followed its rapid, unimpeded infiltration through the stomach lining directly into the bloodstream, bypassing digestion entirely.
From there, we hit the liver, where we uncovered the fatal vitamin tax. We saw how the liver is forced to cannibalize the body's critical supply of vitamin B1 just to oxidize the solvent, setting the stage for systemic neurological starvation.
Then we mapped the complex fiber optic network of the nervous system, highlighting the insidious two-pronged attack. The solvent directly melting the lipid insulation of the nerve cells, leading to corrupted signals and hallucinations, while simultaneously starving those same nerves of the nutrients required to rebuild.
That dual biological assault ultimately manifests as toxic amblyopia. We analyzed the terrifying chemical synergy of combining alcohol with the oxidative stress of smoking, resulting in a slow, chronic theft of sight that begins with a simple evening fog, literally deletes the color red from a person's reality, and slowly erodes their central vision.
And finally, we examined the acute, violent devastation of methyl alcohol, where the liver's attempt to metabolize the chemical produces internal formaldehyde and formic acid, leading to cellular suffocation, primary optic atrophy, and rapid total blindness.
And perhaps the most mind-blowing part of this entire exploration, I want to remind you, the listener, of the sheer scope of what we've uncovered. This unbelievable amount of physiological destruction, this intricately detailed map of sensory degradation. This only covers the first half of Dr. Wad's medical analysis.
It's true. We have focused almost exclusively on the direct chemical degradation of the optic nerve itself and the liver's metabolic failure.
We haven't even touched the second half of the science. We haven't explored how this solvent infiltrates and disrupts the complex physical mechanics of eye movement, the paralysis of those tiny biological pulleys, or what it does to the vascular system, the delicate network of blood vessels that physically feed the eye. The rabbit hole of human biology goes so much deeper.
The complexity of the human eye and its profound vulnerability to subtle chemical alteration is an incredibly vast landscape to explore.
It really is. And it leaves us with a deeply provocative thought, a lingering question to mull over, based purely on the physical mechanics of everything we've learned today. Think back to the very beginning of our dive, to that idea of the physical lenses through which we view reality.
The biological hardware of our perception.
Exactly. If a common everyday chemical substance has the raw microscopic power to physically dissolve the insulation on your nerves, to literally delete specific wavelengths of color from your brain's processing center, and to cast a physical biological fog over your world by slowly starving the high voltage cable of your optic nerve. I mean, what subtle, unnoticed changes to your perception of reality are happening right now?
That's a great question.
Right. What tiny misfires are occurring inside the complex grid of your own biology long before the fog ever sets in?
It is a profound question about the threshold of our own perception and the invisible limits of our biological resilience.
It fundamentally changes how you think about the invisible machinery operating right behind your eyes. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We love unpacking these incredible microscopic realities with you, and we hope you walk away with a totally new perspective on the intricate, fragile engineering of the human body. Until next time, stay curious.